University's Native American Nations and Communities Liaison, and I want to welcome you to TCU's 5th Annual Native American and Indigenous Peoples Day Symposium. We want to begin today by considering the many relationships that we have by being associated with Texas Christian University, and TCU's land acknowledgement calls our attention to them. It also calls us to consider the responsibilities that we have. And I ask you to carefully consider these as I read the university's land acknowledgement. As a university, we acknowledge the many benefits we have of being in this place. It is a space we share with all living beings, human and non-human. It is an ancient space where others have lived before us. The monument created jointly by TCU and the Wichita and affiliated tribes reminds us of our benefits, responsibilities, and relationships. So we pause to reflect on its words. This ancient land, for all our relations, we respectfully acknowledge all Native American peoples who have lived on this land since time immemorial. TCU especially acknowledges and pays respect to the Wichita and affiliated tribes, upon whose historical homeland our university is located. And now I would like to ask the president of the Wichita and affiliated tribes, Terry Parton, to lead us in a prayer to begin our session. President Parton.
Thank you, Scott. If y'all bow your heads, I'll pray. Gracious, most heavenly Father, dear Lord, we thank you for this blessed day that you've given us, dear Lord. We just thank you, dear Lord, for all the opportunities that you allow each and every one of us, dear Lord, to partake in life, Heavenly Father, all the journeys that our lives give us, dear Lord. Dear Lord, I pray, dear Lord, that you would just be with us tonight as we go through this panel and this discussion, dear Lord, that we remember those Native women that are missing, dear Lord, those that maybe not got to have as long of a life as that we've been able to enjoy, dear Lord. I pray, dear Lord, that as we talk about these things, dear Lord, that we just open our eyes, dear Lord, to not only the things that happen, but the things that lead up to those things happening, dear Lord, that we would take responsibility within our tribal nations and universities and our communities, dear Lord, to just make sure that we're all better people, dear Lord, that we could help others along, Heavenly Father, so that they don't get into these situations, dear Lord. Dear Lord, I just thank you, Heavenly Father, for all the blessings that you give us. And I pray, dear Lord, good things upon our community and everyone that's present tonight, dear Lord, that they would take something good from this discussion, Heavenly Father. Dear Lord, I just thank you for all the blessings that you give us each and every day, dear Lord. I pray that you just be with the Texas Christian University and the things that they're doing, dear Lord, to bring these things to light, Heavenly Father. I just thank you so much for all the blessings that you give us each and every day. In Jesus Christ's name, amen. Thank you.
Thank you, President Parton. So before I introduce our panelists, I want to share with you some information about how the session will run. We are going to take questions from the audience. We definitely want all of you out there to participate. And so we invite you and encourage you to submit questions at any point along the way, and you can do that by placing them in the Q&A function. And while we may not be able to answer every question, we definitely want to answer as many of them as we can. We also recognize that the issues addressed by this year's symposium may be particularly difficult to process, especially for survivors of sexual violence and intimate partner violence. So we urge everyone to take advantage of the many counseling and support services available at TCU and elsewhere. And during tonight's discussion, we will post some of those resources in the chat box, but we especially want to name Leah Carnahan from the TCU Care Office, who is a confidential resource on campus for survivors. We also encourage you to identify other ways to care for yourself and each other as you process today's conversations. We also want to thank the TCU's Neely School of Business, which has graciously and generously provided funding that has made tonight's panel possible. And we want to thank Professor Amina Zarug and her sociology class on race and racism. They are acting as our host class this evening, and we appreciate them taking time out of their class to participate, and hopefully we'll have some good questions from them as well. So this year's symposium theme is Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit People, from Awareness to Action. And tonight's panel seeks to understand how some of the underlying causes and issues are manifested in specific Native American communities, particularly the Wichita and affiliated tribes and the American Indian communities in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex and in Northeast Oklahoma. So we are greatly honored to have three distinguished panelists to lead our discussion, and I want to introduce them briefly, and then we will jump into the discussion itself. So Terry Parton, we've already met her. She is president of the Wichita and affiliated tribes and has been since 2012, and she was the tribe's first elected female president. She received a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration from Southern Nazarene University and a Master of Jurisprudence in Indian Law from the University of Tulsa. The Wichita and affiliated tribes consist of the Wichita proper and the Waco, Keachai, and Tawakoni bands. It is headquartered in Anadarko, Oklahoma, with an enrollment of over 3,400 citizens. Our second panelist is Jody Voice Yellowfish. She is Muskogee Creek, Oglala Lakota, and Cherokee. She was born and raised in Dallas, Texas, and is a product of the U.S. government's relocation program. She attended Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas, where she received her associate's degree in social work and studied for her bachelor's in Indigenous and American Indian Studies. Jody is the chairperson for MMIW Texas Rematriate. She's a board member of Dallas Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, and she organizes with Our City, Our Future. She recently became the first Indigenous person to be appointed to Dallas's Arts and Culture Advisory Commission, and she possibly is the first to ever serve on any board or commission in Dallas. She is also an adoptive parent to her niece and two nephews. And those of you at TCU will recognize Jody because she's a frequent speaker on our campus and has provided a tremendous amount of leadership and guidance to us throughout the years. Our third panelist is Olivia Gray, and we are especially grateful to her because she graciously accepted our invitation at the last minute. We were to have President Nita Batiste, our chairperson Nita Batiste of the Alabama and Coshada Tribe of Texas, but she was unable to be with us tonight due to some unforeseen circumstances. And so Olivia accepted our invitation at the last minute, and we are really fortunate to have her. She is a citizen of the Osage Nation and is the founder and chair of the board of the Northeast Oklahoma Indigenous Safety and Education Foundation. She has spent the past 5 years in advocacy for Indigenous women who are victims of violence in the form of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and human sex trafficking. So those are our three panelists. I'm sure we're going to have a great discussion tonight, and let's begin with the first question. I'll ask the question, give each panelist an opportunity to answer that, and then to make up any follow-up questions, and then we'll move on. So this is the last session of our symposium, which has actually been running for several days. We have spent considerable time discussing missing and murdered women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. We began last Thursday with a screening of the film Two Spirits, which was sponsored by Women in Gender Studies. On Sunday, our keynote speaker, Anita Lucchese, spent time with members of MMIW Texas Rematriate in a good discussion there. And then Ms. Lucchese met on Monday with members of TCU's Native and Indigenous Student Association and some invited guests, and we had a very fine discussion there. And then Ms. Lucchese gave 2 presentations yesterday as well. So tonight is the final session of our symposium. And we know that there are many underlying causes and related issues to this crisis. For instance, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, economic inequalities and disenfranchisement, sex trafficking, youths who leave their families, ongoing legacies of colonial violence, and more. So the question that we want to begin with, and I will ask President Parton to respond first, and then we'll go to Jody and then Olivia. This is the question. So in your particular community, in your respective communities, what underlying causes or related issues to the MMIW G2S issue are present, and how do they affect your communities? President Parton.
Good evening, everyone. So I haven't had a whole lot of experience with MMIW. It always, I can tell you from 2002, every time I hear of MMIW, I think of this one individual. She was part Wichita. She was my age, just a few months older than me, but she went missing. And every time I hear of that, I always think about her. And so, and then just this last year, we've had an issue with a missing young lady, because she was later found and stuff and everything. But those are really my only experiences directly with that. When you talk about the other things that surround that and how those things might happen, and you talk about, domestic abuse and the addiction and stuff like that might go on in the home that might lead to those other things. In our community, there's not a lot of opportunity. There's not a lot of jobs. There's not a lot of things to do outside of, a lot of people drink, have addictions to drugs and stuff like that. And so there's not a lot of things to do. So they end up getting into other things that maybe they might not do had they had other opportunities. And so, education levels, there's college in Chickasha, there's one in Lawton, there's nothing here like in our town and stuff like that. And so still those opportunities might even be hard for some of our Native people. But a lot of things that I see too are a lot of, I'm really close with a lot of our tribal members and stuff, and like to hear their concerns and things that go on and stuff. But you hear a lot about, we have a lot of domestic abuse programs. And we also have a lot of SAMHSA programs that deal with substance abuse and alcoholism and suicide and stuff. And I think those things, to me, just hearing about, some of the issues and stuff, you have young ladies that might come in and talk to you about things that they're going through and struggling. And a lot of it's just confidence and acceptance for who that person is. And I think if I don't know how to address it. I mean, we can put all the programs out there that we can and stuff, but I don't know how to address it unless we do it as a society. But making sure that people feel accepted for who they are, that everybody's different in some way or another, but you have to feel that you're accepted somewhere. Even in our tribal communities, bringing people, our own tribal people back home and back into our activities. We do a lot of, luckily we have a lot of SAMHSA grants, and we're able to do a lot of cultural activities, and we do that for the other tribes here that are partners with us too. So it's not just focused toward Wichita, but I think it gives people a sense of belonging. And I think, if if we could do more of that in our communities, then a lot of the stuff that happens that gets people into situations where they're with an abusive partner, or where they're, getting into drugs and alcohol that might put them in situations that they might not otherwise be in, getting them the opportunities that they need for education. I think that would help in some ways cut down on some of the things that some of our people go through as related to domestic abuse that could eventually lead to somebody being murdered or missing or something like that. And I don't really, that's what I see in our community. I know every community is different and stuff, but just trying to do more prevention to keep our people from getting to into those situations and stuff. And anyway, that's all my comments right now. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, President Parton. You've given us a lot to think about there. And one thing in particular you noted was having this sense of belonging. And that may be something we want to return to later on after our other two panelists answer this question. And maybe we can probe that a little bit further. Jody, could I ask you to talk about how your respective community, which would be the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, how these underlying causes or issues are present there and how they affect your community?
Yeah, of course. So hello everyone, good evening. So yeah, I think that is a big thing for all of us tonight that we'll be speaking, is this on a broad scale, this kind of lack of resources and this lack of understanding. And when I say broad, I mean that for our city as well. Like, we're out of Dallas specifically, and our city faces this lack of resources, and not only via our IHS facility, which is the Indian Health Services that we do have in the city, but on this broad scale for all people. We need fuller access to proper and appropriate mental health care, and alcohol and addiction resources, options for the unhoused to still receive care. That is a big thing where our relatives that are on the street, they don't have anywhere to be safe in any kind of way. Domestic violence resources, and and I bring up domestic violence with the aspect of our IHS facility here. We have one IHS clinic that helps our area, and there's a big lack in that care, with no real resources to help our relatives find safety. I think that is possibly one of the biggest issues, in that our community, in this big, vast urban setting, we're a huge city here in Dallas. And I feel like that lack of, or that knowing that there is a lack of resources from the one source of healthcare you can get, is a big deterrent of sharing anything about one's experiences with intimate partner violence, domestic violence of any kind. And I think that directly leads to our community fleeing a dangerous situation, and then that leads to them being dubbed a runaway. And that is something you do not want to be called in our city, especially if you're a minor. Our city still, our state deals with status offenses. If you run away, you get status offenses. So many runaways, you go to juvie, and then starts the cycle of in and out of institutions of that kind. So I feel like there's just these lack of resources, they stem from a lack of understanding how we kind of navigate through the world, and how we, how kind of what President Parton mentioned about belonging, being a relocation site, where there are hundreds of tribes represented. And so that there's community, but we're all over, and you may not feel comfortable getting the help you need or telling your story in the right space. And I feel that belonging really feeds into these lack of resources that we kind of face. And I think the number one thing is to just really say that, the lack of resources directly feeds into the crisis that we deal with.
Okay, so you've raised several issues there. Lack of resources being dubbed runaway. We certainly want to come back and probe those a little bit, but also you brought up the issue of community. And of course, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex is a big urban community that's different than, say, Anadarko or, perhaps even the community that Olivia serves, although, I know there's urban communities there as well, but we might want to talk about the differences between these different communities and how they impact how you address these issues. So maybe we'll come back to that. But let me bring Olivia into the conversation now. And again, Olivia, thank you so much for coming and helping us tonight. Thank you. And please, first of all, can you tell us a little bit about your community or the communities that you represent, and then how these underlying issues are present there and how they affect your communities?
Well, Northeast Oklahoma is a large area. It's probably as big as a lot of states on the East Coast, I would say. So Tulsa being the largest population center, it's large. I think there's probably about 600,000 people in Tulsa, but then there's tiny towns as well. And there are many tribes present here historically, like their reservations are here. But then because Tulsa is a big urban center and like Bartlesville's a decent sized urban center, we have many tribes here that maybe their reservations aren't here. I think one thing about Northeast Oklahoma, which is probably a lot the same as Jody experiences in Dallas, because of relocation, a lot of people were moved to Dallas and to like Wichita, Denver. So a lot of different tribes had to learn how to coexist. And that's the same thing in Northeast Oklahoma. So we have kind of a mix, I guess, of very large urban settings and then just towns with like hundreds of people, like a few hundred people. So we have to wear many hats and adapt to different surroundings quite often. As well as learning how to adapt to whichever tribe that we're working with. And a lot of the people here too belong to many different tribes. Like one case of a missing person, they could belong to 5 tribes. So we just kind of learned how to adapt. The acronym for our organization is NOISE. So if I say NOISE, that's what I'm talking about. I will ask you guys to forgive me if I look at my notes though, because this was like not a lot of notes for me. And I want to make sure I stay on track because I tend to talk and ramble. So when we founded NOISE, it was founded around the idea of MMIR, but with my background as an advocate for victims of domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, human sex trafficking, sexual assault, all of that. Our board, I think the first meeting actually, we sat down and we started talking about the issue at hand, and that conversation turned into prevention. We would prefer nobody go missing, and we would prefer nobody get murdered. So how can we work towards preventing that while we're doing this more immediate work that needs to happen when somebody is missing or when somebody's been murdered? So those are 3 entirely different things, even though they're all connected. So we started talking about risk factors at that point. We were brainstorming risk factors. And what we know as Indigenous people is that everything is connected, whether that's something good or something bad. We know that all things are connected, and our minds kind of work that way. And I think that was just kind of a natural way for our board to move, and seeing all of these connections and all of these synchronicities. And so I think all of the things that you mentioned are present in our cases. In many of our cases, more than one of those things are present. So in that thought, of how things are connected. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So in the greater Tulsa area, we have a large homeless community. And at Noise, we call them our relatives who are without homes. Because again, everything is connected. We understand that everything is connected and that we are all relatives. And so when we talk about our relatives without homes, we can see how they can easily go missing or become murdered, and nobody pays attention to that. Essentially, as far as society is concerned, they're kind of throwaway people. But when we look at those folks, and my t-shirt, for example, I'm wearing a t-shirt right now because I was working with our relatives without homes just this morning. And so I've just kind of come in from that. And so a lot of the people that I've worked with just today were victims of trafficking. You know, when you are someone who's living on the street, it's easy to see how easy it would be to traffic. Or how easy it would be for some of those folks to participate in just survival sex work because they've got to eat. If it's snowing, they've got to find a place to stay. If they have addiction issues, you know, they have to have their drugs or they get very sick. And so we look at all of those synchronicities. And just like you mentioned, kids coming out of their homes, we know that when there are studies done on trafficking, most trafficking victims have a history with Child Protective Services, with CPS. And so if you think about that, you know, when kids go into foster care, they're more likely to be abused. They're more likely to be sexually assaulted. Well, when you're a victim and you have that trauma and that damage, you're more likely to continue to be a victim because of the damage that's been done to the way that you think, the way that you make decisions, kind of defenses that you've taken on, like substance abuse, things that have happened as a result of that, like behavioral health issues. It's so much easier for other people to victimize you at that point. And so we really recognize that how everything is connected. And I also wanted to mention that we also can't ignore the fact that Indigenous women are fetishized, and that's very, very dangerous. We can talk about risk factors all day long and how to prevent those risk factors, and we should be talking about those things. But I think it's also important to realize that there are some very awful human beings in the world, a lot more than any of us want to realize. And until we raise our children to be healthy, happy, well-adjusted adults, and we continue to get these sorts of people in the world, people are going to continue to be abused. And that's just really the truth. It doesn't matter if someone is abusing substances or not. I've had all kinds of clients. It doesn't matter whether they are participating in sex work or whether they are, I mean, I've had school teachers that needed help. It doesn't matter about income. I've had people who didn't have a home, and I've had people who were married to a plastic surgeon and lived in a mansion. So as long as people are being raised in a way that makes them think they can harm others, especially people of color, because we aren't always seen as fully human. I think as long as that continues, then people of color are going to be abused. That's going to continue. And so I think it's good to deal with immediate issues like substance abuse and poverty and domestic violence and all of those things. But if we don't look at the long game, if we don't look at the people that are causing the harm, those people will always find victims. They will always create victims. So we need to look at that and make adjustments in how we are raising human beings.
Well, Olivia, if I can ask you to stay on, because I want to follow up here. And honestly, for each of our speakers, I've created a list of several things I want to follow up with each one of you on, but we don't have the time. So I'm going to really exercise some discipline here and just ask one follow-up question to each of our panelists. We'll start with you, Olivia. Where do you see the legacy of colonization playing into these issues and factors that you and President Parton and Jody have discussed? You know, what is the role of colonization and colonial violence in all of this?
Well, it created the first victims, didn't it? And when you carry trauma, again, there are all these residuals that happen. So it makes your mental health tank. You may abuse substances to numb yourself from the memories of what's happened to you. I think on a broader scale, that when we're talking about colonization, it busted up our communities. It busted up that support and that nurturing that our people have always had. That, you know, the saying, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, our children don't have that village as much anymore. And that causes a really harmful effect. So one of my grandchildren, excuse me, one of my grandchildren started our immersion school at the Osage Nation when she was 6 weeks old. Everyone there was Osage. All the teachers there, all of the students, everybody, even the maintenance people, everyone there was Osage. Everyone there was invested in the success of those children and the nurturing of those children. And I can tell you, the kids that come out of our immersion school, they are the most confident children I have ever seen in my life. I wish as an adult I was that confident. And so I think, you know, that hurt us. We don't have that blanket of love and safety and nurturing that we had throughout history. And so, you know, I think colonization really took a huge toll on that. But I think also they just don't see us as human beings. And so when you don't see someone as human, it's easier to cause them harm or to act out these really sick ideas on our people, especially in terms of trafficking and child molestation and things like that. So it's affected us negatively in many ways, but those would be my biggest things.
Okay, thank you. And so I want to bring Jody in to answer that question as well, but let me also remind the audience, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function and we will try to get to as many of those as possible. So Jody, as a follow-up, could you talk about the role that colonization, and just so that we're clear, we're talking about European and later efforts by the United States to commit genocide against American Indian peoples, indigenous peoples, taking their lands and resources, that whole process. So Jody, what role do you see colonization playing?
I see it still playing a very big, if not the biggest role in the crisis that we deal with. You know, I mean, looking back, you know, like how Olivia said, you know, it created our first victims, and, you know, that hasn't stopped, you know, and I tell every time I'm asked about the amount of cases or how widespread is this really, are the numbers, you know, if the numbers are correct, and they're never going to be correct because we don't know, because of that violence, that gender-based colonial violence that founded this country has really never stopped. And once people, you know, there are, you know, times where you're saying like, you know, it doesn't necessarily isn't gender-based, it's still, you know, you're dealing with it, and you're dealing with that violence, although it looks different now. You know, that erasure of our humanness has directly affected our everyday reality of what we deal with. You know, MMIW cases, they deal with such a broad array of issues. They're not just when somebody is missing. You deal with so much leading up to it. If you're dealing with minors, you're dealing with, you know, they're not just runaways. You know, we have so many of the, you know, like Olivia said, these busted up families and communities, you know, they end up in the system, they end up in foster care, and we all know what happens to you know, our children that go to foster care. So these systems, you know, this wasn't a way we took care of our people. You know, the social work systems, you know, in our country, those aren't the way we took care of our people. And there's just so much pain happening, and we don't have all the healing that needs to happen. And they just, all of this violence and trauma is just continued, and it's a direct effect of how this country was colonized.
Okay, thank you. And I think an important point you've made is that colonization is not something that happened in the past and then ended, but it is ongoing today, and very aggressive forms in some of the same ways as it has in the past, but also in new and different ways as well. So thank you. President Parton, could we bring you back and get your perspective on how colonization may be affecting or feeding into these problems? And then after you respond to that, I want to go to our next major question. So if you would just stay on for that as well.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I think it had a big effect on just how our people are view their lives today and stuff. You know, a long time ago, when you were, like she was saying earlier, you know, people lived in villages, they were supported, they had not just their mothers and their fathers and their aunts and uncles, everybody was together, and they knew who they were. And going back to Olivia's comment about the immersion school and how they come out confident, you know, they're around all their Osage people, they know who they are, they know where they belong. And, you know, I think as colonization happened and people went their separate ways and stuff, and you've got one Wichita here that's immersed in culture and dances and can sing songs and know about their tribe because they were able to be raised that way. And you've got another one that may be the same amount of blood, maybe a cousin of that person that was raised somewhere else, and they don't know who they are. You know, they weren't raised Wichita, they weren't raised Native, they were raised somewhere else. And so I think it breeds in them just something, not knowing, like I said earlier, not knowing where they belong. Do I belong out here where I'm going to school and I don't have very many Native friends around and stuff, and I'm trying to fit in, when in my heart, I see my relative over here dancing and singing their songs and knowing their language, and I don't know that. I can't feel that. I can't be part of that. Because I wasn't raised like that. It's not that you can't be part of it, but there's I always use this, I know our Wichita songs, hymns, I can sing them. I can teach them to little kids and stuff like that and do that. It's harder for me to do it for adults because I sat in church listening to those songs and hearing them myself, and I want to share them, and I can share them with kids because I know that it'll be instilled in them from a young age. But trying to share it with somebody else that's my age, it's not the same feeling, and I don't know how to, or I can't teach it the same way as I did because I learned it as a child and stuff. And so I just think that colonization and people being raised in different communities and stuff, I think that breeds you know, a sense of a lack of confidence in knowing who you are sometimes. I'm not saying everybody's like that, but for a lot of our people, they just don't know where they belong. You know, they don't know how they're supposed to be because they know in their heart they're Native. They want it. They belong to a tribe and a community, but they weren't raised that way, and so it's harder for them sometimes, I think, to take part in that. And but you know, even people in our own Native communities, they struggle too. They struggle too because now they're here, they're raised like that, and maybe they don't have the education, or maybe their families, you know, don't have the resources to do what all of their other, you know, Native friends are doing that have, you know, that their parents went to school, they weren't raised in their tribal communities and stuff. And so it's kind of like a two-edged sword, you know, it affects both people, and it doesn't matter which side, you know, which side of the fence you're on, or I don't know if the fence is right, but it's just that colonization just brought all of that. It just kind of tore all of our communities apart, and because of the way the world is now, you can try as much as you want to preserve that and bring people back, but it's really hard unless everybody move back into their own communities. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, so I want to go to our second question, but I would say someone in the chat box asked, why are people relocated? And I would just say, and you can correct me on this, but a lot of it goes back to a policy by the United States government, which they implemented in the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s, called the Indian Relocation Program. And this was designed to take Native peoples from rural areas, reservation areas, move them into urban areas under the auspices of improving their economic opportunity. But it was also a tool to try to assimilate Indian peoples into broader American culture and society, and to erase their particular society. And so relocation of Indian peoples stemmed from that. And then, of course, today people move around just like anybody else to get jobs and things like that. Is there anything you would like to correct or add to what I just said in explaining relocation?
No.
Sounds good. Okay. And then we have another question in the chat box, or in the Q&A box, which gets at the second question. So from the Q&A, it says, how do communities deal with the grief of loss at a large scale? And that sort of anticipates the question that I was going to ask, which is, how are your respective communities responding to these underlying causes and issues? What challenges do you face? What successes have you had? And so maybe in that you could incorporate how you respond to loss as well. So we'll start with you, President Parton, and then we'll go to Jody and then to Olivia.
Okay. I do want to bring up the young lady that I talked about, whenever I was first started working here at the tribe. They've never found the person that murdered her. And it was part of a, probably a serial type thing where there were several ladies that were murdered in the Lawton area and stuff. And so they've never found her. And I don't know why that, I knew her from coming in here at the tribe with her aunt and stuff. And I don't know. I don't recall how that was handled or anything. That was almost about 10, 20 years ago. So that situation was a long time ago, but it still rings. I mean, every time I think of MMIW, I think of that young lady and stuff and the things that happened to her. And again, I haven't had to deal with that. I've been here at the tribe 23 and a half years, 9 years of that. The last 9 years have been in my position as president. And only this last year, we've had to deal with a missing young lady, and it's hard too, because, as a tribal leader, you have to be very careful about how much you get involved in other people's, some people are private, some people want your help and want it publicized and stuff and everything. And so, with that young lady, I had several conversations with some of the family members and how we approach how we were going to help, and plus you don't know if they're just runaways and, they just don't want to get in contact with their family. You don't know if they're really missing and stuff like that. And so you have to be very careful about how you handle those situations and stuff. So we had several discussions. We got the BIA law enforcement and the Anadarko Police Department involved and stuff and started talking to them. And then we were able to, our executive committee put up some money so that if that person was found, we would have what do you call it? Not an award. Anyway, money for anybody, any information that led to her finding her. Well, we ended up being able to find her. She was actually in Texas, and she was brought home safely and stuff and everything. And so that was my only experience in that situation. But a lot of people came together and stuff and tried to help find her and everything. I don't know, I'm kind of got way off about that. So in that instance, you know, we came together with local law enforcement and the tribe, the family and stuff, and put out those flyers and stuff, and we're able to help that young lady get home and everything and stuff. But again, I haven't had that much experience in those instances. And so I do know that, you know, if that situation were to arise again, that we would follow the same protocol. We would bring the family in, talk to them, and make sure that before we put that out, because I know another thing, and I know it's sad, but you see this happen with suicides and other things, especially with social media, because people start putting stuff out there, you know, somebody committed suicide, look at this person, you know, all the stuff they did, and mourning them. And then you start seeing this thing where these other kids, they see where this person was, is remembered in a good way, you know, through social media and stuff like that. And you have to be very careful, because I think then too, it starts people making people feel some way about themselves. You know, people don't think this much about me, you know, maybe I'm better off, you know, doing the same thing or something like that. And it's the same thing with, somebody that goes missing, because just right after that happened, I had another call. Somebody couldn't get a hold of somebody and wanted us to put out flyers for that person. And it was not the same caliber. So they ended up, that person just didn't want to, I guess, get in contact with them. And so, you know, you have to be very careful about how you approach that, because then people will not start taking you serious once you start putting all these flyers out about people missing, and then, you know, they're found. It's a shame that people would do that, but, you know, some people start wanting that for attention too. And so, you know, that's a way we would handle it. And as a tribe, we would be very careful about how we engage with those situations, to make sure that, you know, everything is legitimate and stuff. And it's just not somebody, you know, family disputes and somebody not wanting to talk to somebody or something like that. And so anyway, that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you very much. Jody, let's bring you back and give you a shot at this question. But before I ask you to address this question, there's a question that came in the chat that I think you can especially address because you have experience with it. So if you could just give a quick answer. I know there's not a quick answer, but if you could answer somewhat quickly the question of why are runaways put in juvenile detention?
Yeah, so quickly, within Texas specifically, Texas is a state that, like, parents have a lot of rights. And I know that sounds odd, but in terms of where they go, where children go, how things are handled, you know, a parent can say that a child is a runaway, and sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes, you know, like just being dubbed a runaway, like I mentioned earlier, can be terrible for somebody, especially minors. You know, I've seen cases where they run away because they just came out as LGBTQ plus. They came out and the family wants to get rid of them. They don't want them in their home anymore. They run to stay out of trouble. A family can say that they ran away, we didn't kick them out. So when things like that kind of situation arises, they're looked at as almost like, you know, they're kind of troublemakers. They're doing this for attention, and they're doing it because you know, they want some more freedom, something like that along those lines. So they're brought back, and it gets, you know, habitual. And when that happens, you know, I forget how, at the moment, I forget how many or how many offenses you have before you're picked up and you're taken every time you run away.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, to the other question, and I would say we've got about 10 minutes left, and we've had a lot of good questions from the Q&A that we've been able to work in, so we're doing good, but we still only have 10 minutes left. But how in your community, how have you responded to these causes and issues, and what are some challenges and successes that you've had, and how do you deal with overwhelming grief in just a few minutes?
Yeah, I think within our community here, some challenges have been, and I know that it's not just here, but some things that we have dealt with is not a full understanding of the depth or the seriousness of a case. It's easy to support the cause, or the movement. And I try to stay away from those words as much as possible, because I want to have the right language surrounding this work, because it is work. It is a lot of work to understand and find resources and find the right people to do the work alongside you. I think that's been a thing. One of our kind of obstacles in doing this is to make sure that our community is educated, and that's a task in itself, is to understand what it is that MMIW groups and advocates do, because we started as just education and kind of awareness raising, but we went past that and got to where families needed help. So I think our education is on a community level is at a different level now, of understanding what like one of our biggest things is educating on what happens when your relative goes missing, or a relative, and it's kind of how we phrase it to show that connectedness. So I think it's taken a while to get the education, but the connectedness within that education has really helped. So it's like it was an obstacle, and it can be an obstacle, but it really has brought people together to do the work in a time of crisis. And I kind of feel like with that too, you have the smaller little obstacles within every case. Our communities are so connected. Families are connected. Indian way, we have relatives, and it can be it can be a lot for people just to see and feel like they're on the sideline, because they're not actually like helping work a case, because they're not within a group or something like that. And people want information, and I think that's kind of a dangerous thing to do, and a lot of our community doesn't understand that just yet, why it's dangerous to share details and things like that. I think those are some of the smaller obstacles, but dealing with all that frustration and grief, dealing with cases and things like that, it's because this work gets really heavy. You really have to have some faith in what you're doing and who you are. And I think leaning into our history and our past and our culture has really helped myself and our group here in Dallas kind of understand why we do it. When we make sure that we pray, or we make sure that we sing, or we make sure that we're bringing younger people into what we're doing, I think that alone actually helps kind of lessen that heaviness that comes along with that overall grief and passed down and shared pain, I guess.
Okay, thank you, Jody. So Olivia, if I could ask you to give us your perspectives on this question about how your communities are responding to these causes and issues, challenges, successes. How do you deal with overwhelming grief? And we have about 6 minutes left. So again, I apologize for that, but if it could be, a few minutes.
Well, we could all talk all night on this stuff, so I understand. So at Noise, what we do is we have a very diverse board and membership. First of all, we vet our members. We make sure that we look at their background, and they can't have any violence in their background. So there's that part. So we make sure that we're not causing harm as much as we can. But also our board, we have people on our board who specialize in substance abuse prevention and intervention. We have people on our board who also work in harm reduction. So for our relatives who are not willing or ready to be clean, we still don't want them to die. So we work in harm reduction so that when they're ready, they're still alive to be ready. We have people, of course, myself on the board, and I know domestic violence and, all of the violence against Indigenous women issues. We have all kinds of people on our board that do all kinds of things and can give us really good perspective. We have people that are very tuned in and connected with the sex work world so that we can offer help for people that are endangered there. I think the main thing we do is we come at it in a very non-judgmental way, a very accepting way. We're always reminding ourselves, we check in with each other and make sure that we are treating everyone as a relative. And just like in any family, some relatives are harder to deal with than others, but we still love them though. And so I think that's where noise comes at it, as just, these are our relatives and we want them to be alive. So that's how we do it. And in terms of the overwhelming grief, I think just Indigenous people in general have had to learn how to deal with that since the boats landed. And so we all do it in different ways. Some ways are not healthy. Some ways are maybe more healthy. I don't know if there's an ideal way to deal with that kind of grief. But when we lose someone, it hits us hard. And especially in Northeast Oklahoma, again, all of the tribes are very connected. We all dance together. We all sing together. Some of us are more than one tribe. And so when there's a loss, we all feel that. And we all mourn that loss. And hopefully, depending on how connected, I guess, they are with the tribe, we can come together, all of us, and support each other and love each other while we mourn. I think it was really evident when they started finding the children at the residential schools. It hit all of us hard, whether we knew those families or not. It was just a reminder of how much we've lost and how much promise we had lost. And so we just we cling to one another when things get hard like that. And if I'm having a bad day, then one of my relatives is having a strong day. So we cling to one another and we love one another through it. And we remind each other that we are the survivors. We come from the survivors and we have to continue on.
Okay, thank you very much. We have just a couple of minutes left. And so I'd like to bring all of our panelists up. If you could, each of our panelists turn on your camera so that we can have a quick answer to this last question. As you've said, we could go on and on and on all night talking about this. But this will not be the last conversation, because at TCU, we're committed to dealing with this issue as best that we can. So we'll be carrying on in the future. But I want to give someone who submitted a question in the Q&A, give them the last question. And we only have 2 minutes. So if each of you could give a brief answer, starting with President Parton. And this person asked, how do you continue to see dehumanization in non-native institutions such as healthcare services and the U.S. criminal legal system? President Parton.
I guess I'm not sure, how do we continue to see, are we still seeing it? Is that what the question is?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, I think probably a lot of it too is just recognizing that, there's a lot of Native Americans that are in prison and institutions, and being able to make sure that they are able to connect with their culture and their tribe. Again, it all goes to a sense of belonging, so they have somewhere else to belong to. I think it still exists. And I don't have an answer to fix that at the moment. So, but it does exist. I believe that.
Okay, thank you. Jody?
Yeah, so dehumanization, I mean, that's across the board on all institutions. I mean, any kind of the first thing I thought when you meant, or the question mentioned in the legal system, the first thing I thought was I've been asked for help here in Dallas, and they would not report somebody missing, and literally asked me, can you help me figure this out? Because I don't want to call, and literally they said the killer cops. So that dehumanization is there for everyone across the board, not just Native people, but all communities of color deal with that dehumanization. And I think we just deal with it in different ways, different levels on every situation. We have that dehumanizing factor, that fetishization that a lot of people don't understand or see. And just many things like that contribute, mascots, things like that, costumes, dehumanizes us to every level that we're disposable. And that's why we have this crisis that we deal with.
Olivia?
Yeah, I think a lot of the same. Institutions, I think by and large, are designed just to roll people in and roll people out. And it's very easy to do that with people of color. We're numbers, like just when we talked about the foster care system, that's a moneymaker. If you can get a bunch of Native kids into foster care, that's a moneymaker. If you can get them medicated, you get more money because now they're in a different classification. So I mean, institutions are institutions, they're not communities. There's not a vested interest in seeing us be healthy and thrive.
Well, thank you to all three of you. You have really given us a lot to think about, a lot to ponder. I know at TCU we have our students who will be future politicians and lawyers and doctors and teachers and nurses and dancers and musicians and on and on and on. And hopefully their awareness of these issues will be raised so that when they get in positions of power, they can do something to address these issues and make for a better situation here. But I thank each of you tremendously. You have honored us by being with us tonight, and we have learned from you, and thank you for teaching us. And thanks to everyone who joined us, and we'll continue the discussion on down the road. So thank you and good night.